I examined for the class a case study which is the BUGISP in South Sulawesi, Indonesia. Sulawesi is the largest island in the Indonesian archipelago, and the Bugis are the largest ethnic group in Sulawesi, so there's about 3 million of them. They were examined primarily by an anthropologist named Sharon Graham Davies, and it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, so it's a relatively recent case study. But the case study isn't really, or at least my intention of the presentation, isn't really to look at the Bugis so much as to look at the way that they construct gender identity and a comparison to the way that we construct gender identity within Western culture, and to try to see what we can learn about the construction of gender in general. So in order to do that, I think that it's good to have just a quick review of terms to understand the difference, because in the Western discourse, and there's a lot of problems with the word Western, so the way that I'm using the words Western discourse, and I'm speaking extremely quickly, so let me slow that down. The way that I am using the term Western discourse is sort of the general idea that we have within the United States outside of gender scholarship, but just the general idea of the population. So the definition of sex has to do with an interpretation of the physical body, meaning whether a person actually has a penis or a vagina. In Western culture, we recognize two sexes, male and female, and we sort of posit them as opposites, that they don't have a whole, that they're at opposite ends of a spectrum. Gender is a set of roles, expectations, and behavior. So it's very easy, I think, having been raised in the United States, to confuse the ideas of sex and gender, but it's really important to understand the way that the Bugis conceptualize gender to realize that they're actually different. So in Western culture, gender is closely associated with sex, and the commonly recognized genders are masculine and feminine. So the roles that we expect of gender, kind of like the last presenter was talking about, were things like submissiveness and docility. The roles that we expect are to be mothers of children, and the behaviors that we expect are to be submissive, to dress in a certain way that's feminized. And so there is a distinction, and it's going to be important to remember. Sexuality has to do with whom one sexually desires and the roles that one desires to play within sexual exchanges. The three commonly recognized sexual orientations in Western culture are heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual. In Western culture, sexuality is often related to gender, such as an expectation that masculine men are heterosexual. So I think that if you want to remember the distinction, then that sentence makes sense, right? You have masculine men, heterosexual. They're actually different concepts, even though they really get put together a lot in the way that we talk about sex and gender. What makes gender? So in Western culture, we have a sex binary and a gender binary, meaning that we have two identities that are posited as opposites. When we talk about what makes up gender identity, and we talk about the masculine and the feminine, they're opposites of one another. When we talk about femininity being docile, we contrast it against masculinity being aggressive. And so these things aren't seen as related on a continuum, they're seen as two opposite sides of a binary. Gender identity in our culture is based almost entirely on biological sex. This is shown by the idea that transgender and transsexual people often say that they feel trapped in the wrong body. So if somebody is transgender in Western culture, they don't want to be somewhere in the middle, they relate to the opposite gender identity. And this will all make more sense when we start to talk about the Bugis. Gender identity is often thought of as separate from sexuality. A person can be a woman who identifies as homosexual. Her sexual identity is different than her gender identity. And that's something that's emerging more now. In the traditional discourse, they were very much related, sexuality and gender. So the Bugis are not like us because they have 5 gender identities. They have men and women, men being those that are biologically male and that have masculine characteristics as defined by their culture. That's something really important to mention about gender, is that gender is always socially constructed. So what is masculine or feminine in our culture is defined by our culture. It's not the same in every culture. So what makes a man masculine in the Bugis is actually very similar to our culture. It's to be a breadwinner, but rather than aggression, it has a lot more to do with being reserved and being in control of yourself. The Bugis are a Muslim culture, and so there are really very subtle but really important differences in the way that Islam frames masculinity and femininity. So there are men and women. Women, again, it's a very similar conceptualization of gender to Western ideology. So meaning that you are docile, that you're a mother, that you're a wife, and that you're really the embodiment of the honor of your family. So you present the way that you present yourself is a reflection of the way that you were raised by your family. But they have these other really interesting genders. So they have the Kalalai, who are masculine women. Ooh, woman, that was wrong. So they are masculine women, meaning that they are women who are biologically female, but they dress the way that men in their culture dress. They do jobs the way that men, the same jobs that men in their culture do. So they would be like blacksmiths was the example that I saw commonly. They have female sexual partners who identify as women. And they are, they identify as Kalalai. And then there are Kalabai. I was unable to find a picture of a Kalalai, by the way. So there are Kalabai, who is in the red, and they are feminine men. So they dress in typically female clothing. They do typically feminine jobs, such as wedding planning. They have male sexual partners, and it also has to do with the role, whether you're a penetrator or being penetrated within sexual exchanges, has to do with their sexuality. And then there are Bisu, who are androgynous priests. And they're truly androgynous, meaning that like biologically male Bisu will often shave one side of their face as a way to show that they're really an embodiment of masculine and feminine. And they're really revered spiritually. And apparently weddings, there wasn't a lot in my case study, but weddings are a really huge deal among the Bugis. So the role that people play in wedding planning has a lot to do with their gender identity and their gender construction. Is everyone with me so far? Because it's kind of complicated. We're good? Okay. So what determines gender among the Bugis? We talked about a little bit before. There is biological sex. There's factor X, which is something that they talk about that would be similar to like a chromosomal component. How we have people that are intersex that have different chromosomes that lead to a different combination of male and female. They don't frame it quite as chromosomes, but they believe not only that gender is a continuum, but that sex is also a continuum. So that people's actual bodies can be different combinations of male and female. There's also the work that one wants to do, the way that one dresses, and then there's a concept called kroda, or fate. And it's really interesting because it's the way that they make peace with having these alternative gender identities and being Muslim. So when Kalalai, who are masculine women, go to the mosque to pray. I don't know if anyone's ever been to a mosque, but men and women pray separately. And so a question that Davies asked them was, where do you pray? And the Kalalai said, I pray with the women because I'm a woman. Because it doesn't mean, to dress like a man doesn't mean that a Kalalai wants to be a man. She's not trying to present as a man, she is a Kalalai. In order to be a Kalalai, she must be biologically female and dress like a man. So it takes into account all of these different factors, but they sort of recognize the supremacy of your body, that your body determines the possibilities for your gender, but doesn't determine it alone, the way that we think of it. And when they talk about fate, they say, I didn't choose my fate. I didn't choose the internal orientation that says that I want to be a Kalalai or a Kalabai. God chose that. And therefore, they're able to really make peace with the ways that there is, in a lot of other Muslim cultures, a lot of homophobia and a lot of really strict ideas about gender identity, because they say God did this. It was his choosing, and therefore, you know, we're not wrong. So, and then sexual orientation also plays a really large role in the way that they define gender, to the point that if there are Kalabai who are attracted to women, Kalabai being feminine men, then they'll say you're a fake Kalabai. You can't be a Kalabai that's attracted to women, because part of being a Kalabai means that you're attracted to men. So it's all tied in very closely. The Bugis have no concept of gender identity and sexual identity as separate issues. No Bugis would identify as transgender or homosexual because their gender system integrates these separate concepts into one gender identity. Because they have more than two gender identities, and what determines gender identity is more inclusive, they demonstrate a true gender continuum. Meaning that instead of a gender binary, the way that we have it in Western culture, they really show the way that you can have a fluid continuum between gender identities. Is everyone with me there? Because it's hard. You got it? All right. Oh, that's the end. So, I mean, I think that why this matters to us is that when we're looking at the construction of gender and sexuality within our own culture, there's this idea, we get really wrapped into this binary. So to say that if I am somebody that's transgender, often if somebody is a female to male transgender person, they will dress as a male, they'll attempt to present as a male, they'll want to be referred to as a male, and I think that maybe some people genuinely feel that way, but I also think that we don't make room within our culture for anything in the middle. We don't look at gender as something that takes into account all of these aspects of what we know intuitively to be gender. Part of my gender is who I want to make love to, it is how I dress, it is the kind of work that I want to do, it is the roles that I play in life. But we don't make room for those things within our conceptualization of gender. And as a result, gender can be really oppressive and really limiting for a lot of people. And as there are, you know, those of us that are gender scholars know that there is this real emerging movement of trans rights and people that are transgender wanting to be recognized for their different unique gender identities. But it's really difficult because we are stuck in this strict binary thinking. And I think that though this is a group of 3 million people that's halfway around the planet, we really can learn a lot from them in terms of the way that they look at gender and the space that they make for people to really fully express themselves. That's all I got.